Hello everyone, we've just seen the eagerly awaited autumn budget, and as we expected there were a number of important housing announcements contained within it. I'm delighted to be joined by Melanie Rees, who's our Head of Policy, and we're just going to take you through some of the major announcements and what we think about them. So Mel, the last time there was a budget, so the spring budget, we didn't even produce a guide, did we, because there was that little in it. There was really nothing in it of note on housing. How different is it this time around?
Very different in that sense. Plenty on housing. In fact, the team are working on our member briefing at the moment and have just said it's the first time they've ever seen a chapter dedicated to housing in the budget statement. So in many respects, that's really positive to see.
Yeah. And what was your gut reaction when we watched it together, didn't we?
Yeah.
And so we could put our reaction out. What was your gut reaction to what we saw?
Mixed, I think, and I think that's reflected in our statement. We certainly wouldn't argue with an extra 300,000 homes. We desperately need those. But the really important thing is it's not just a numbers game. We need the right houses and the right types in the right places and at prices people can afford. Hand on heart, I'm a bit disappointed there wasn't more mention of affordable homes to rent, or more importantly, homes at the lowest social rents. And we'll continue to make the case for that.
Yeah. Okay. We'd said in advance, hadn't we, about councils, and we thought there might be something on supporting councils to become house building again. We've seen that in high demand areas there's going to be some movement on borrowing rates for councils. What did you make of that announcement?
We welcome that. We and others in the sector as well have been calling for government to recognise the role that councils can play in developing new supply. We've identified the borrowing cap as a barrier. So it's positive that government's prepared to consider that, because at one time we thought they wouldn't. So it shows that they're listening. The fact that it's restricted to high demand areas, we need to see what the detail is around that and how they define how demand, and if it's so restrictive few can get in on the Act. There's £1 billion there for this. But there are some other things that we'd still call on government to consider. So things like allowing councils to keep all the receipts from homes sold under right to buy, having a little longer to spend it than 3 years. But it's a start and it feels like somebody's listening.
Yeah. That's always good, isn't it? And something else that it feels like the government's really listened to sort of concerns on is universal credit. So we expected something to happen around waiting times, didn't we? But actually I think it's fair to say we probably saw a bit more than we expected. What did you make of the announcement on universal credit, and do you think it goes far enough?
It's encouraging. There's been such a powerful weight of evidence saying what the difficulties were, most recently from the National Audit Office, and then housing providers like Curo and Holton Housing have been really vocal about the impact on their residents of it. So things like the 7-day waiting period, it's positive to see that's being taken care of. The fact people will be paying back advances over a longer period, because that was really punitive to be doing it in a 6-month period, that was a concern. And for people to continue to have housing benefit for 2 weeks as well might make a difference and alleviate some worries about meeting housing costs. But there are still some underlying concerns about the way that the benefit is being administered, the delays, the inaccuracies. There were systemic delays like the 7-day waiting period, but then there's the delays that are occurring because of the way claims are being processed, and we think that needs attention, and I think others agree it needs to be slowed down so that you can learn before rolling out further.
Yeah, that's interesting. And another thing that we saw, actually, which again wasn't entirely expected, we saw Philip Hammond mention families that are really struggling, families particularly who are renting privately and really, really struggling to pay for their rent. We saw a couple of things on that, didn't we? First of all, some new targeted affordability funding to sort of try and plug some of that gap between LHA and the cost of rent. And we also saw something on longer tenancies, didn't we? What did you make of all that stuff?
Well, this is something we've been doing a lot of work on and a lot of thinking on. We've been doing some modelling on, it's a technical term, but targeted affordability funding that government pays in over heated areas in terms of housing costs because of that widening gap between LHA and actual rents. It's positive to see that there's an amount for that over the next 2 years that will help some households in the private rented sector, but it's no replacement for unfreezing local housing allowance rates, and that's what we've joined others in calling for, and that's something that really needs attention, we think. In terms of the longer term tenancies, again, that's something we've been doing some work on. We know that end of assured shorthold are the single biggest cause of homelessness. There are more and more households living in the private renter sector who have children. 6 months revolving tenancies is no stability for families. So it's interesting governments prepared to consider that, because previous governments wouldn't have, because they might have seen it as fettering the private market and putting landlords off. So it's interesting that we can see some signs of that there. Just to add, we know it was something that the former Housing Minister Gavin Barwell was concerned about, but didn't bear fruit in the Housing White Paper like we thought it might. So it's interesting that that's cropped up again.
Yeah, and as you say, obviously ending of a short-term tenancy, biggest cause of homelessness, was interesting to see some action on homelessness.
Yes.
Another thing that we'd sort of represented in our submission ahead of the budget, with the Housing First pilots. What did you make of that?
It's really positive to see some hard funding for that, because these things won't happen on their own. So pilots in Manchester, Liverpool and the West Midlands are things we'll be watching closely, and it's positive to see that. We've published a guide today on Housing First, so take a look at that. It's on our website. The Homelessness Reduction Task Force has been announced as well. I believe they're up to strength now with 8 members to go out and work with local authorities to help them gear up for the new legislation in April. So yeah, some positive things there.
So overall then, some good, some not so good.
Yeah. Yeah.
What would your summing up statement be on this year's budget?
I think it's a good start, but we'd like to see more.
Yeah, well said, well said. You can see more of our reaction, you can see our full reaction, and we'll also be putting together a more detailed guide on our website, which is cih.org. Thanks, Mel, and thanks for listening.